You guys are amazing. I'm so lucky to have one of the best communities on YouTube. I've always had a goal hitting 1,000 likes on a vid, but you guys smashed it on one of the vids and got it to 2,000 likes. Thanks so much. Let's try and get a high score on this video. Please smash that like button. I know you guys can. It's free and it means the world to me. Thank you so much.
The phone call that never stopped. I thought I was being paranoid at first, but now I'm sure it all started a few months ago, and I really wish I could just forget it ever happened. So I live in a tiny apartment in a not so great part of town. It's cheap, but it's also isolated, which I guess is fine for me since I keep to myself most of the time. My neighbors are decent enough. They keep to themselves too. No issues. Or at least, that's how it used to be. One evening, I was getting ready for bed when my phone buzzed. It was a random number, but I figured it might be a telemarketer or some scam call I could ignore. Still, I checked it out because I'm one of those people who can't stand the idea of missing an important call. When I answered, I didn't hear anything for a few seconds, and it was just some muffled breathing. No voice, no hello, just breathing. I hung up annoyed. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just a wrong number or someone's kid messing around. But then it happened again. A few nights later, around the same time, my phone buzzed with that same random number. I picked it up, fully expecting to hear the same thing. Sure enough, the muffled breathing came through the phone, slow and steady, like someone was trying to keep quiet. I could almost hear a faint shuffle in the background, like someone was pacing. I tried saying something, but they hung up before I could even get a word out. I should have blocked the number right then and there, I know. But I didn't. I think part of me wanted to figure it out. Like it was some weird prank. Maybe someone had the wrong number. Maybe someone was messing with me. I wasn't freaked out yet. I thought it was just an annoying coincidence. Over the next week, it kept happening. Same number, same time, around midnight every night. The breathing got louder each time. The worst part was that after a while, I started hearing soft whispers in the background, like someone was talking to themselves, but not loud enough for me to make out the words. I couldn't even tell if the voice was male or female. I finally blocked the number, and that seemed to work for a little while. No more calls, no more creepy whispers. I thought it was over. I could finally sleep without hearing that weird, creepy sound in the back of my mind. But then, a couple weeks ago, the calls started coming from a different number. It was a random stream of numbers this time, though. The new number was local. It had a 718 area code, which I recognized because it was the area I've lived in. I don't know why, but that freaked me out way more than the random numbers had. It felt personal. I had to pick up this time. What if it was someone trying to apologize? Or explain why they'd been doing this? I didn't know. I should have blocked it immediately, but my curiosity got the better of me. The second I picked up, I heard the breathing again. But this time it was different. The voice on the other end was distorted somehow, like someone was trying to disguise their voice but was failing miserably. The whispers were clearer now, and I could make out a few words. They sounded like watching and waiting, but it was hard to tell if I was imagining things. I hung up fast. I couldn't stand it anymore. I blocked the number right away, but that didn't stop it. The calls just kept coming. It didn't matter how many numbers I blocked. They kept calling from different local numbers, all with the same area code. One night, after a particularly disturbing call, I was feeling like I was losing my mind. I didn't know what to do. So I started recording the calls. I figured if it was some sick joke, I could at least have proof. But what I captured wasn't something I could explain away. The voice on the other end sounded closer that night, like it was in my apartment. I couldn't tell for sure, but I swear I heard the faintest sound of footsteps right behind me just before the call ended. I froze, my heart pounding, and I swear I heard a faint knock on my apartment door right as the call cut off. I've never been more scared in my life. The next morning, I decided I needed to get the police involved. They took the recordings, but they were skeptical. I didn't blame them. It sounded insane, right? I mean, who makes creepy calls every night like that? Still, they told me they'd look into it, but I wasn't holding my breath. The calls didn't stop, though. It didn't stop even when I started staying with friends for a few nights. One night, after being at my buddy Mike's place for a couple of days, I got a call from that same local number again. This time, I wasn't even at my apartment. It hit me. Whoever this was, they knew where I went. They knew I was staying with Mike, and that was when I started feeling completely trapped. How the hell did they know? Was I being followed? I tried to think rationally, telling myself it was some crazy coincidence. But when I checked the time of the call, it was exactly the time I left my place to head home. That was the last straw. I moved out of my apartment the next week. I found a new place in another neighborhood, hoping to escape whatever nightmare this had become. But the worst part, the calls never stopped. I don't live in the same area anymore, but last night I got a call. Same local number, same muffled breathing. This time, though, when I answered, I heard something different. There was a long pause before the same distorted voice said, "We'll be seeing you soon." That was it. I don't know what to do anymore. I've tried everything. Moving, blocking numbers, even changing my phone number. But they always find a way to call. If anyone has had anything like this happen, please let me know. I don't know who's behind it, but I feel like I'm being hunted. I just want it to end. The Man in the Window. This story might sound crazy, but I swear to God, what happened to me was real. It all started last year when I moved into a new apartment. I'd been living in the city for a few months, trying to get settled into my new job and everything, and finally found a place that seemed perfect for me. It wasn't too expensive, and it was close to work. The area wasn't the best, but it wasn't terrible either. A little sketchy at times, but I thought I could handle it. The apartment was on the second floor of a building that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, with faded walls and a creaky elevator. It was a small, one-bedroom place, and when I first moved in, I was just happy to have somewhere to crash after a long day. The windows face a narrow alleyway between my building and the one across from it. No real view, but that was fine with me. The first few nights were normal. I got used to the noise of the city, cars honking, people yelling, sirens in the distance. It wasn't quiet, but I liked the hustle and bustle. But then, one night, I noticed something strange. It was late around 2 a.m., and I was just finishing up some work at my desk when I glanced out the window. It was dark outside, the alley barely lit by a single flickering streetlight. But then I saw it, a figure, just standing there directly across from my window staring at me. I froze. I thought maybe it was a neighbor or someone who had wandered into the alley, but it fell off. The person was standing perfectly still, just watching. No movement, not even a twitch. It was so creepy that I actually considered calling the police, but then I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was probably someone just taking a smoke break or something. I tried to shrug it off and went to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept the blinds half open that night, just to see if the person was still there, but the alley was empty. I felt silly for even worrying. The next few nights went by without incident. I got into a routine, work, sleep, repeat. I forgot about the strange figure. But then a week later, it happened again. I was watching TV, lying on the couch around midnight, when I glanced at the window. There it was. The same figure standing still in the alley, staring up at my window. This time, I didn't feel so silly. I felt terrified. It was like my gut was telling me something wasn't right. Why was someone standing there, staring at my apartment at this hour? Was it someone messing with me? Or was I being watched? I couldn't just ignore it this time. I grabbed my phone and took a quick picture, just to have some proof in case I needed it. When I zoomed in, though, my heart sank. The figure wasn't just standing there, it looked like it was waiting. Almost like it was expecting me to notice. I spent the next few hours staring at that alley from behind the blinds, but the figure didn't move. It stayed there, stock still, just watching. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in my mind. The next day, I made a decision. I was going to find out who this person was. I didn't want to go straight to the police just yet, but I figured I could do some detective work on my own. Maybe I'd catch them in the act, and then I'd have answers. I spent the next few days being extra vigilant, keeping an eye on the alley when I could. But every time I tried to look out the window, the figure wasn't there. It was like they'd disappeared. I thought maybe it was all in my head, that I had just imagined it all. I didn't want to be the crazy person, seeing things that weren't there. But then to have it again, and this time, it was different. I was sitting in my living room late at night, just trying to relax after work. I had my blinds pulled open slightly, but I wasn't really paying attention to the alley. Suddenly, I heard a noise. It was soft at first, like a tapping sound coming from the window. I thought maybe it was just a branch or something, but then it came again, louder, more deliberate. I froze. I didn't dare move. The tap came once more, followed by a long, slow scraping sound. My heart raced. I didn't even want to look out the window. but I had to. I crept toward the blinds, feeling my stomach churn. I slowly pulled them open just enough to peek outside, but when I looked out, my blood ran cold. There, standing just inches from my window, was the same figure. Except now it wasn't just standing there. It was pressed up against the glass, staring directly at me. It was a man, tall, with a hood over his head, but the worst part was his eyes. I couldn't see his face clearly, but his eyes were wide open, and he was looking directly into mine, unblinking. I could feel his presence like a weight on my chest, even though we're separated by glass. I don't know how long we stood there, just staring at each other. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few seconds. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. I ran to the door, bolted it, and called the police. I didn't care if it sounded crazy. The man had been right there, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. When the cops arrived, they checked the alley and the building but found nothing. No sign of anyone. They told me it was probably a prank or just my imagination, but I knew what I saw. I knew what's happening. That was a week ago. Since then, the figure hasn't shown up again. I've kept the blinds closed all the time now, but I still feel like I'm being watched. Every time I hear a knock or a strange noise outside, my heart skips a beat. I don't know if he's still out there or if he's gone, but I can't shake the feeling that he's watching me waiting. I've thought about moving. I've even started looking at other places, but something tells me it's not over. I don't think it'll ever be over. If you've ever had something like this happen to you, please tell me I'm not crazy. The mysterious guest. I'm going to start off by saying I'm not the type of person who believes in creepy, supernatural stuff. I've always been more of a science explains everything kind of person. But what happened to me a few months ago? I don't know how to explain it, and honestly, I've been trying to forget about it ever since. It was a Friday night. I'd been feeling exhausted all week, working long hours, staying up late, and just feeling like I was running on fumes. So when I finally got home from work, I just wanted to crash. I had plans to meet up with some friends the next night, but tonight was for me. I didn't even bother with dinner. I just grabbed a bag of chips and a soda and went straight to my couch. I have lived in the most glamorous neighborhood, but it's not bad. My apartment is small, but cozy. It's an old building with creaky floors and thin walls, but I don't mind. I usually keep to myself, and I like it that way. Anyway, around 9 p.m., I heard a knock at my door. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm home alone and someone knocks, my first thought is, who the hell is bothering me at this hour? My first instinct was to ignore it, but then I thought it might be a neighbor. Maybe someone was locked out or had a delivery for me or something. I reluctantly got up, looked through the peephole, and froze. I couldn't see anything at first, just the usual hallway, but then I noticed something odd. There was someone standing at the door, but their face was blurry. It was like I couldn't focus on it. They were wearing a long coat, and their head was tilted down, so I couldn't get a good look at their face, but there was a strange, heavy silence hanging in the air. I could feel my pulse picking up, but I didn't want to seem rude, so I opened the door just a crack. There was no one there. I mean, there was someone there. But as soon as I opened the door, the figure had disappeared. Just gone. I wasn't sure what to think. I assumed I'd imagined it, or maybe someone was messing with me. But the weird thing was, I felt an odd chill in the air. Like something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I shut the door and locked it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was outside. I decided to leave the chain on the door just in case. The whole thing just felt off, and I couldn't settle back down. I tried to brush it off, told myself it was just the exhaustion messing with my head, but then the knocking started again. This time, it was more persistent. Knock, knock, knock. Not frantic or urgent, just steady and methodical. I went to the peephole again, and this time I could see the figure more clearly. It was the same person, standing there, still with their head down. They weren't moving, but they weren't going away either. At this point, I was freaking out. I didn't know who this person was, but they were clearly waiting for something. I don't know why, but I felt like I had to open the door. I don't know if it was curiosity or just a dumb decision, but I slid the chain open a bit, cracking the door just enough for the person to see I was there. Before I could say anything, the person looked up, and my heart nearly stopped. Their face was pale, so pale it was almost gray, like a corpse. The eyes were wide, unblinking, and they had this strange, hollow stare that made my stomach churn. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. My whole body was frozen. The person opened their mouth, but no sound came out. Just silence. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was happening, but I couldn't focus. I wanted to slam the door shut, but my hands wouldn't move. And then the person smiled. I don't know why, but the smile wasn't comforting. It wasn't friendly or welcoming. It was wrong. It was wide and stretched across their face in a way that made my stomach flip. I could feel this coldness creeping through the door, and it felt like it was swallowing me whole. I don't even know why I did it, but I closed the door. I didn't say anything. I didn't scream. I just closed it as fast as I could, locked it, and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. I could still feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't dare look through the peephole again. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about that smile, of how wrong everything felt. I'd even checked the window a few times to see if the person was still out there, but the alley outside was empty, as it should have been. The next morning, I thought I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was sleep deprived. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after a long week. But when I opened the door to leave for work, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the ground in front of my door, was a small, crumpled note. It wasn't there when I closed the door the night before. The handwriting was messy, barely legible, but the words were clear. I'm still waiting. I've never been so terrified in my life. Since that night, I haven't seen the person again. I don't know if they're still out there, waiting, or if I was just imagining it all. But I can't shake the feeling that they're still watching me. I've moved all the furniture around, made sure there's no way anyone could be lurking outside my windows, and I've kept the blinds shut tight. I haven't had anyone knock on my door since, but every time I hear a sound late at night, any noise at all, I find myself holding my breath, waiting for the knock, waiting for the person to come back. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I don't think they've forgotten about me. And I don't know how much longer I can stay here, wondering when they'll show up again. The mysterious apartment. I don't know how to explain what happened to me. It's been a few weeks now, and I still can't wrap my head around it. This whole thing started when I moved into a new apartment. I'd just gotten out of a bad living situation, and I was ready for a change. I found this place on Craigslist. It seemed perfect, cheap rent, close to work, and the neighborhood seemed all right. The landlord was nice enough, and I figured it'd be a great spot to settle into. The apartment itself was old. The building was probably 50 years old, maybe more. The walls were thin, the floors creaked, and the elevator barely worked. But the rent was cheap, and honestly, I didn't care about the little things. The first night was fine. I unpacked a few things, set up the living room, and just relaxed. The only thing that stood out to me was the noise in the hallways. It wasn't loud, just kind of this soft, shuffling sound, like someone was walking around late at night. I figured it was the neighbors, but I didn't think much of it. I was just glad to be out of my old place. The next night, things got weird. I had just gotten home from work. As usual, the hallway had that faint noise. This time, though, it was different. The noise wasn't normal. It was louder, like someone was pacing back and forth in front of my door. I stood there, holding my keys, trying to decide if I should open the door or just call it a night. But before I could do anything, the noise stopped. Dead quiet. I shrugged it off, unlocked the door, and went inside. That's when it got worse. The next few nights, the pacing outside my door continued. I was getting really freaked out. At first, I thought it was just a neighbor with bad habits, but then the pacing started happening at odd hours, like 2 and odd. It'd go on for a while, sometimes an hour or more, before finally stopping. I couldn't ignore it anymore, so one night I decided to be bold. I waited for the pacing to start, and then I crept out of my apartment to see who it was. I didn't turn on the lights in the hallway. I just stayed in the shadows, listening. The pacing was louder than ever. I waited, and finally, when I thought I had enough, I peeked around the corner. Nobody was there. I checked the whole hallway. No one. No one was pacing. No one was walking around. I stood there, feeling like an idiot. I figured maybe someone had been walking through the hallway, but when I looked at my phone, the time told me it was way too late for anyone to be doing anything. I went back inside, and the pacing stopped that night. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but then it started happening more often. I couldn't sleep. It felt like every time I was about to drift off, I'd hear those footsteps again. It got so bad that I started locking my door at night and setting my phone's camera on the floor to catch whoever it was. But I never saw anything on the camera. Nothing. The pacing would start around midnight and keep going for hours, but whenever I checked the footage in the morning, it was just empty hallways. I was losing it. The pacing was getting louder, and I started seeing shadows move under the crack of my door. I couldn't see anyone, but I could tell someone or something was outside. It was like I wasn't alone. Every night, the same thing happened. Pacing, shadows, silence. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, opened the door, and stepped into the hallway, hoping to finally figure out what the hell was going on. I walked down the hallway, listening for anything. There was nothing. No footsteps. No sounds. Just complete silence. But when I turned back to my apartment, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My apartment door, was wide open. I swear I locked it that night. I was certain, but there it was, wide open. The hallway was still empty. No one was there. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest. I walked into the apartment, and nothing seemed out of place. Everything was normal. Except for one thing. There was a note on the kitchen counter. I didn't recognize it at first, but when I saw it, my stomach dropped. The note was simple, handwritten in what looked like a child's handwriting. I'm right behind you. I couldn't breathe. I turned around, my eyes darting across the room, but there was nothing. Nothing behind me. Nothing in the room. But I could feel something, like there was someone there. I ran out of the apartment, didn't even bother locking the door. I stayed with a friend that night, and the next morning I called the landlord, asking if anyone had been messing around with my door. He said no one had a key but me. I packed up my stuff that weekend and left. I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. I don't know who or what was in that hallway, but I couldn't risk finding out. I've moved into a new place, and the noises have stopped. But every time I close my eyes, I can still hear that pacing. Every time I'm alone, I can still feel that presence, like someone's always right behind me waiting. I don't know what happened in that building, but I don't want to know. The basement door. Please listen to this. My whole family think I'm crazy. I'm writing this because I seriously need to get it off my chest. I've been thinking about it a lot recently, and I don't know if anyone else has experienced something like this, but if you have, please let me know. I feel like I'm losing my mind. I moved into a new house about 4 months ago. It's not an old place, but it's definitely got some history. I was looking for a fresh start, new city, new job, all that. The house seemed perfect at first. It was spacious, had a decent backyard, and the neighborhood seemed quiet. Nothing special, just a regular suburban home. The first week was fine. I didn't even think twice about the layout or any weird noises. But as I started settling in, I noticed something strange. There's a basement in the house. It's not huge, but it's got a lot of space. The door to the basement is in the kitchen right next to the pantry. At first, I didn't think much of it. I mean, it's a basement. Lots of houses have them, right? You just store stuff down there and move on with your life. But after a few days, I started hearing noises from down there. It wasn't like a big crash or anything, just these little scraping sounds. Like something was shifting or moving around, but I never saw anything. I figured it was just the house settling or maybe some pipes or wires shifting, whatever. Still, the sound was persistent. The weirdest part was that the door to the basement always seemed to be slightly open, no matter how much I made sure it was shut. I go into the kitchen, and there it would be, just a crack of light coming through, as if the door had been nudged open by someone or something. It happened so often that I started to feel paranoid. I mean, I was the only one living here, so who else could be opening the door? After about a week, I decided to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight, and I went down there to see what was causing the sound. The basement was dark, cold, and musty. There was a lot of old furniture down there, nothing too weird, just some chairs and old boxes, things like that. The sounds weren't coming from the furniture, though. They were coming from the far corner behind an old wooden wardrobe. I took a few steps closer, trying to be quiet, but my heart was pounding. The closer I got to that corner, the more I could feel this pressure, like the air was heavier, like something was wrong. And then I saw it. There was another door. It was small, wooden, and kind of out of place. It didn't look like it led to anything useful. It was just there, hidden behind the wardrobe. I don't know why, but I felt like I had to open it. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe just a crawl space, maybe just another storage area. But when I opened the door, I saw something that I will never forget. It was a long, narrow hallway. It didn't make any sense. There was no reason for this hallway to exist. It was like it had been added in after the house was built. The walls were covered in this dark, peeling wallpaper that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The air smelled stale, like something had been shut off from the rest of the house for ages. I stood there for what felt like forever, just staring down the hallway. It seemed to stretch on for miles, but I knew the house wasn't big enough for that. My mind raced. What the hell is this? Why hadn't I ever noticed it before? I don't know why, but I stepped inside. I guess part of me thought I'd find an answer or something, but I couldn't shake this feeling of dread that hit me the second I crossed the threshold. The further I walked down the hallway, the colder it got. And the further I went, the more I could hear something faint, like footsteps. I darn froze. At first, I thought maybe it was my own footsteps echoing, but the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't. Someone or something was walking behind me. But when I turned around, there was no one there. I panicked. I didn't even look to see where the hallway ended. I just ran back toward the door. But when I got to the door, it slammed shut with a loud bang and I couldn't get it open. I started pulling at the handle, trying to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. It was like someone was holding it from the other side. That's when I blinking heard it. The sound of breathing. Heavy, uneven breaths coming from just behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I felt this coldness crawling up my spine, and I just knew something was standing right behind me. I didn't even think. I just shoved the door open, ran back into the basement, and slammed it shut. I locked the basement door and sat there for a while, trying to calm down. But even now I can't get that feeling out of my head. The breathing, the footsteps, that damn hallway. I haven't gone back into the basement since, and honestly, I'm not sure I ever will. I've done some research into the house, but there's nothing about it that says it's haunted or anything like that. The weird thing is, the more I think about it, the more I wonder if the hallway is even real. Every time I go into the basement now, I can't find that second door. It's like it disappeared. I don't know what happened that night, or if I just lost my mind. But I'm not going back down there. If anyone else has had something similar happen in their house, please tell me. I don't know if it was something I imagined or if something's really down there, but I don't think I'm staying in this house much longer. The stranger in my backyard. I don't know what it is about this town, but it always feels like something's a little off. I've lived here my whole life, but recently, I've started noticing things that I just can't explain. This one night, though, it was something else. So I'll start with the setting. My house is at the edge of town, sort of in a more isolated area. It's not like I'm in the middle of nowhere, but it's definitely quieter. The kind of place where you know everyone who lives around you, and no one bothers you unless they really need something. Anyway, this all started about a month ago. It was late one Friday night. I just finished some homework and had nothing else to do, so I figured I'd go out and relax in the backyard. I've got a small porch, a fire pit, and a few lawn chairs. Nothing fancy, but it's peaceful and I like to chill out there when it's nice. I was sitting there scrolling through my phone, just minding my business when I started hearing something weird. It was a soft, rustling sound, like footsteps in the grass, but it was really faint. At first, I thought maybe it was just some animals like a raccoon or a cat, since I've got a lot of wildlife that wanders through my yard at night, but the sound kept getting louder. Now, my backyard isn't huge, but it's big enough that if someone's walking around in it, I'd notice. I kept listening, trying to figure out if I was just imagining things, but the sound was still there. It was like someone was walking in circles around my house. I tried to ignore it at first, but then I heard something that made me freeze. A knock. Not on my door or windows, but on the back gate to the yard. It was really soft, almost like it was testing if anyone would hear. I felt this weird chill run through me, and my mind started racing. There was no reason for anyone to be out there at this hour. I stood up slowly, not wanting to make any noise, and walked over to the window to peek outside. I couldn't see anything at first, so I stepped out onto the porch to get a better view. My backyard is surrounded by a 6-foot wooden fence, so it's hard to see much unless you're standing right against it. I walked around the edge of the porch, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone. But then, right as I was about to turn back inside, I saw something move. At first, it was just a shadow against the fence, but it wasn't the shadow of a tree or anything. It was too tall, and it shifted unnaturally. It didn't make sense. It was like it was straight too human-shaped. I felt my heart rate spike, and was frozen for a second trying to figure out if I was seeing things. But then, as I looked closer, I saw it. Someone was standing on the other side of my fence, right up against it. I couldn't see their face, but they were there, crouching down, just staring in my direction. I panicked. My first instinct was to call the cops, but that I thought maybe it was just a weird prank or someone messing around. Still, my gut was telling me something wasn't right. I didn't know if they could hear my breathing or see me from where I was standing, so I quickly ducked behind the porch railing to hide. I stayed there holding my breath for what felt like forever. It felt like time had stopped. I could hear my heartbeat thumping in my ears. The silence outside was almost suffocating, and I didn't dare move an inch. Eventually, I gathered enough courage to peek out again. Whoever had been standing there was gone. I don't know how, but they had disappeared. I searched the yard, checked the back gate to see if they'd left, but there was nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. I told myself I was just overreacting. Maybe it was just someone walking by or a shadow playing tricks on me in the dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next day, I checked the fence again, hoping to find some kind of evidence that someone had been there. Anything. But everything was normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever, or whatever, had been standing out there wasn't just some random person. I tried to forget about it, go back to my normal routine. But a few days later, I noticed something else strange. My backyard gate, usually locked and secure, was wide open. I didn't leave it open, and no one else had access to it. I immediately called my parents to come over, just to make sure I wasn't losing it, and they confirmed that the gate had been opened from the outside. There was no way anyone could just open it without leaving some sort of trace, right? But again, there was nothing. No footprints, no broken locks, nothing. That night, I stayed inside. I locked every door and window, turned on all the lights, and I didn't go near the backyard. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't get over the image of that person standing against the fence, watching. It was like they were waiting for something. It's been a few weeks now, and nothing has happened again, but I'm still freaked out. I haven't been back out in the backyard at night since. Every time I hear a noise or every time I pass the gate, I get this weird feeling like I'm being watched. I don't know who that person was or what they were doing, but I'm telling you, it wasn't normal. If anyone else has had something like this happen, I'd love to hear it because I can't shake this feeling that there's something I'm missing. Something is still out there. The old man across the street. I don't know if I should be telling this story or not, but it's been bothering me for years. It happened when I was about 17, and I still think about it sometimes, especially when I walk down the street in my old house. It all started with the house across the street from mine. It wasn't anything special. It was just this old, run-down place that had clearly seen better days. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and the windows were always shut, so it gave off this creepy vibe. But honestly, it wasn't anything I really paid attention to. I was a teenager busy with school, hanging out with my friends, the usual stuff. There was one thing, though, that always stuck out to me. The guy who lived there. I'd only ever seen him a few times, but when I did, it was always the same. An old man, probably in his late 70s, wearing a faded flannel shirt and jeans. His face was always hidden in shadows, but he'd stand in his doorway and just stare. He never waved or said anything. He just watched. And I don't mean for a few seconds, I mean minutes at a time. At first, I thought it was just his way of greeting people. Maybe he was lonely, but the more I saw him, the stranger it felt. No one ever came to visit him, and I never saw him leave the house. It was like he was a permanent fixture just watching. One night, it was a little past midnight when I was getting ready to go to bed. I had a window in my room that looked out over the street, and I had a habit of staring out there sometimes when I couldn't sleep. I was looking out the window, and that's when I saw him. The old man was standing at his front door, just staring across the street at my house. It freaked me out, but I figured it was probably nothing. Maybe he was just having trouble sleeping too. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking right at me. He had to have known I was there. I stared at him for a minute, but when I went to turn away, I noticed something. His hand. He had one hand pressed up against the glass of the door, but his fingers, they were moving. Slowly, but they were definitely moving. It was like he was tapping on the glass, but so lightly that it was barely noticeable. I felt the chill crawl down my spine. I quickly shut the blinds, crawled into bed, and tried to ignore it. But I couldn't. I spent the whole night thinking about that old man and his strange behavior. The next day, I decided to tell my mom about him. She just brushed it off, saying he was probably just an old man stuck in his ways and I shouldn't worry about it. But after that, I started seeing him more and more. Every time I looked out my window, there he was, standing at his door, staring across the street. And each time, his hand would be up against the glass, tapping slowly. It was like a routine, like clockwork. No matter the time of day or night, he was always there just watching. One evening, I decided I'd had enough. I was getting sick of this weird old guy staring at me, so I told my friend Jessica about it. We were both curious, so we walked over to his house together. I know, dumb decision, but at the time, we thought it'd be funny. We knocked on the door, but no one answered. We knocked again, a little harder this time, and still nothing. We were just about to leave when we heard a creak. The door opened slowly, revealing the old man. His face was pale and covered in wrinkles, and his eyes were deep set and dark. He stared at us without saying a word for what felt like an eternity. Finally, after a long silence, he spoke. "I don't get visitors much," he said in a raspy voice. "What do you want?" I froze. I wasn't expecting him to talk at all, but his voice was even stranger than his silence. He didn't seem hostile, just odd, like he didn't know how to communicate with anyone, but he was trying. "We were just wondering if everything was okay," Jessica said, clearly nervous. The old man's gaze shifted, and he looked at Jessica like he hadn't heard her. Then, without warning, he stepped back, opening the door wider. He waved us inside. My heart was racing at this point. I knew we should have walked away, but for some reason I couldn't. Something about the way he'd invited us in was almost magnetic. "Come in. I don't bite," he said with a smile, but it was unsettling. I glanced at Jessica, and she hesitated, but we both stepped inside. The house smelled like old wood and something faintly sour, like mold. The floors creaked under our feet as we walked down the dark hallway, and I noticed how narrow the rooms were. Everything felt cramped and confined, like the house was closing in around us. The old man led us into a living room where he motioned for us to sit down. The furniture was old, stuffed chairs with faded fabric and wooden tables with chipped paint. The strangest thing was the walls. They were covered in framed photos, but none of the faces in the photos looked familiar. They were all just people, strangers. I asked him about them, and he just gave me a blank stare before saying, "They're family. All of them." Then he added something that chilled me to the bone. "You two are going to be part of the family, too. I've been waiting for you." I couldn't explain it, but when he said that, something inside me told me it wasn't just weird. It was wrong. We quickly made some excuse about needing to go home, and we left without looking back. After that night, we never saw him again. He wasn't in his yard, didn't stand at his door, and the house was empty. The strangest part, when I checked the house's records, I found out that the man had passed away a year before I even moved into the neighborhood. The house had been abandoned ever since. It's been years now, but I can't forget what he said. It still bothers me sometimes, especially when I walk past that house. I don't know if I was seeing things, or if it was just my mind playing tricks, but I know one thing for sure. I was never supposed to meet that old man. The knock at midnight. I know people say a lot of weird things happen when you live alone, but nothing prepared me for the events that went down in my apartment last year. I'm still processing it, honestly. What happened that night still feels like a nightmare, but it was very much real. I swear, this wasn't a dream. It all started on a random Tuesday night. I live in a pretty standard one-bedroom apartment in a somewhat quiet area of the city. It's a decent place. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. I've never had any issues with noise or neighbors, and I keep to myself most of the time. Honestly, it's usually pretty peaceful. So I'm sitting on my couch around 11:30 p.m. just watching TV. Nothing special, but just zoning out to some random show. The lights in my living room were dim, and the rest of the apartment was dark. I wasn't expecting anyone. Didn't have any plans, so I was just enjoying the quiet night to myself. That's when I heard it. A knock. Not a loud one, but a slow, deliberate knock. It came from the front door. The weird part, I wasn't expecting anyone. I wasn't expecting any deliveries or even friends stopping by. I don't get many visitors, especially late at night. I got up from the couch, confused, and walked toward the door. I peeked through the peephole, but there was nobody standing outside. I thought maybe it was just someone messing with me, so I shrugged it off and went back to the couch. But then, a few minutes later, it happened again. Another knock. Same slow, methodical pace. By this point, I was starting to feel weirded out. I went back to the door and looked through the peephole again. Nothing. There was no one there. I stood there for a minute, wondering if maybe I was just imagining it, but I swear I heard the knock. I checked the hallway outside my apartment, but there was no one around. My neighbors usually keep to themselves, and the building was dead quiet. No sounds in the hallway, nothing that seemed out of place. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and decided to go to bed. I was just chalking it up to a weird coincidence and maybe some tiredness messing with my mind. But then around 2 o'clock a.m., it happened again. The knock. It was louder this time. I jumped out of bed, immediately feeling that knot in my stomach. I checked the peephole again, and still nothing. I opened the door slightly, enough to stick my head out into the hallway, but the space was empty. At this point, I'm panicking. I'm trying to figure out if there's a logical explanation for all of this. Maybe I missed someone earlier. Maybe someone's playing a prank on me. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I started thinking that maybe I was being paranoid. I started second-guessing myself, but it felt so real. I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing those knocks in my head like an echo in my brain. I started thinking about all the possibilities. What if someone was trying to get in? What if something was hiding out in the hallway? I didn't know what to think anymore. The next day, I decided I was just being a little dramatic and needed some sleep. I went to work, tried to push the whole thing out of my head, and told myself I was just tired. But that night, around midnight, the knocking came again. Only this time, it wasn't just a knock. It was the sound of something dragging against the floor outside my door, like nails on a chalkboard. It was slow, purposeful, and dragged on for what felt like forever. I froze in bed. My heart started racing. I got up, pulled back the curtain to peek outside. There was nobody there, but the dragging sound, whatever it was still happening. It was like it was coming closer to my door. I didn't know what to do. I was paralyzed. I couldn't just stay there. I couldn't bring myself to open the door again. I started to think about what kind of sick person would do this. Was it a prank? Was someone playing games with me? I pulled out my phone and called my friend Jessica. She's one of those people who's always down to help with anything, and I was desperate. I told her everything, how I heard knocking, how I heard the dragging sound. She listened quietly, and then she said something that made my blood run cold. You know, there was a weird thing that happened in your building a while back. Some guy was found dead in the hallway. They said no one heard anything, but it wasn't until the morning that someone realized. He'd been knocked out by the door. The door had been broken down. I felt my chest tighten. What do you mean? I stammered, barely able to comprehend what she was saying. Well, the story goes that he was really quiet, didn't have any friends, didn't speak to anyone much. They think he was left out there for hours and no one even noticed. But the worst part, they said after the guy passed away, the knocking kept happening at night, and the dragging sound. That was what people thought was the spirit trying to get into the building. I felt sick. I didn't even say goodbye to her. I just hung up and immediately called my building manager. I was on edge, barely able to speak, but I managed to ask about the previous 10. She confirmed it. The guy had been found dead in the hallway a few months ago. Apparently, no one had ever known what happened to him, but there were rumors that he had been knocked unconscious by his own door and that no one heard him screaming for help. The dragging sound was apparently from the cleaning crew trying to get the body out. That was the last night I stayed in that apartment. The knocking stopped after that, and I never heard the dragging again. I moved out the next week. I'm telling you this now because I don't think I could stay in a place where something like that happened. I've never experienced anything like it, and I don't plan on experiencing it again. The unwelcome guest in my apartment. I've been living on my own for about 2 years now. I got my own apartment right after I graduated college, and it's been the perfect little place to call my own. It's a one-bedroom, slightly small, but it's in a nice, quiet part of the city, and I've always felt pretty safe here. That is, until something happened that has stuck with me ever since. It was a Tuesday evening just like any other. I was coming back from the grocery store, arms full of bags, ready to throw on some sweatpants and binge-watch Netflix for the rest of the night. As I unlocked my apartment door, I noticed something weird. There was a small wet spot right in front of my door, like someone had spilled something, but it was too clean to be a spill. There was no smell, no visible stain, just this little patch of dampness on the hardwood. I thought it was strange, but I was too tired to care, so I shrugged it off and went inside. I set the bags on the counter, grabbed a bottle of water, and plopped down on the couch. I didn't give the wet spot much thought after that. Honestly, I figured it had just rained earlier, and maybe I'd stepped in a puddle without realizing it. I went through the usual evening routine, made some dinner, cleaned up, and eventually sat down to watch a show. Everything seemed normal, but then something happened that made me question what I thought I knew about my apartment. Around 11:30 p.m., I was getting ready to head to bed when I heard a sound. At first, it was so faint that I thought it was just part of the show I was watching. but then it repeated louder this time. It sounded like something or someone scraping against the floor. My immediate thought was that it was probably just the neighbors above me moving furniture around or something, so I tried to ignore it. But then it happened again, and this time it was coming from the hallway. Not above me, but from outside my apartment. My heart skipped a beat. I walked cautiously to the door, listening closely. There was no mistaking it. Someone, or something, was definitely out there, I know it. It sounds crazy, but the scraping sound was like nails on a chalkboard, slow and deliberate, like something was being dragged across the floor. I stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at the door, wondering if I should open it or call someone. I was trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone moving furniture in the building's hallway, or maybe I was just being paranoid. But then, just as I was about to turn around, I heard the sound again. Only this time, it was right at my door. The wet patch outside my door that I had noticed earlier, it was bigger now. It was as if something had been dragged through it, but there was no sign of anything being out there. I slowly backed away, my mind racing with thoughts. Was someone trying to break in? Was there someone in the hallway? I picked up my phone and called my friend Rachel, asking if she could come over. I told her I was hearing weird sounds and needed someone else in the apartment. She was at work, but I could hear the concern in her voice. She promised to come over in about 15 minutes. I hung up trying to calm myself down, but the waiting felt like an eternity. I decided to peek through the peephole in my door just to see if anything looked out of the ordinary, but when I did, I froze. There was a figure standing on the other side of the door. I couldn't make out much, just the vague silhouette of a person. And they weren't moving. They were just standing there. I couldn't even hear them breathing. I panicked. My heart was pounding in my chest. I backed away from the door and quickly locked all the deadbolts. I was in full fight or flight mode, and I wasn't sure which way I was leaning. I grabbed my phone and texted Rachel that I needed her to hurry, that someone was outside. She said she was on her way, but it felt like hours had passed since I sent the message. I couldn't stop looking at the door, my mind running wild with all sorts of scenarios. Who was out there? What did they want? Was it just some random person, or was it something worse? I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Just as I was about to lose it, I heard another sound. It wasn't a knock this time, but the sound of footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps. They were coming from the other side of the door again. I couldn't believe it. Whoever was out there was moving now. Then came the worst part. The door handle jiggled. Someone was trying to open the door. I don't know why I did it, but I moved quietly across the room and grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find. I'm not sure what I thought I was going to do with it. Defend myself, I guess, but I was too terrified to think straight. The footsteps stopped, and for a few moments, there was nothing. Just silence. Then the door handle rattled again, harder this time, like whoever was on the other side was really trying to get in. My blood ran cold. Just as I was about to scream, I heard Rachel's voice calling my name. I rushed to the door and opened it as fast as I could. Rachel stood there, looking concerned and out of breath. I pulled her inside without a word, locking the door behind us. I didn't even tell her about the footsteps or the figure. I just told her that I felt weird and asked her to stay with me for a while. I don't know why, but I didn't want to talk about what had happened just yet. I couldn't. I think I was still processing it all. That night, we stayed up watching movies, not really talking about anything serious. After a while, I noticed something strange. The wet spot in front of my door had returned. It was bigger than before, and there were drag marks leading right up to the threshold of my apartment. I don't know how I missed it earlier, but now I was sure someone had been outside my door. I moved out the next week. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been lurking outside waiting. I still have no idea who or what it was, but I don't think I'll ever feel safe in that apartment again. The Forgotten Letter. So, this happened a few months ago. I've been meaning to share it, but honestly, every time I think about it, I get this weird feeling in my stomach. I'm not even sure what to make of it, but I'll let you decide. It all started when I moved into a new place. I had been living in the city for a few years and was tired of the noise and the chaos. So I found this small, quiet apartment in a suburb that was just far enough away from the hustle and bustle, but still close enough to everything I needed. The place seemed perfect, a little outdated but cozy, and at a reasonable rent. The first couple of weeks were fine. I didn't think much about the history of the apartment or who lived there before me. But then things started to get weird. One evening, I came home from work and found an envelope slipped under my door. It wasn't a typical letter. This one was old, yellowed at the edges, and had no return address. I picked it up, thinking maybe it was something from a neighbor or a mistake, but the handwriting on the front caught my attention. It was messy, uneven, and looked like it had been written quickly. I opened it, and inside was a single piece of paper. The letter was short, but the words stuck with me long after I finished reading it. You don't belong here. Leave before it's too late. I was honestly a little freaked out. My first thought was that it was some sort of prank. Maybe one of the neighbors was messing with me, or some random person in the building had decided to play a joke. But still, it made me uneasy. I decided to let it go, but that's when the strange stuff started happening. The next day, I was sitting in my living room working from home when I noticed something odd. There was a faint smell in the air. It wasn't bad, just different. Like old wood mixed with a hint of something metallic. I couldn't place it. I went over to the window and opened it, thinking maybe it was just some kind of smell from the building's pipes or the neighbors cooking, but it didn't go away. That night, when I was getting ready for bed, I checked the locks on the door like I always do, but this time something was off. The door was locked, but the handle felt loose, like someone had been trying to get in. I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination, but I made sure to lock everything up tight before going to bed. The next few nights were the same. I kept finding things out of place. The cup that I was sure I'd left on the kitchen counter would be moved to the table. The blinds would be open a little more than I'd left them. Small things, but enough to make me feel like I was going crazy. It was as if someone had been in my apartment without me knowing. One night, I woke up to a loud bang. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening. Nothing. Just the sound of silence, the kind that fills your ears when everything else is still. I convinced myself it was just the building settling or some random noise from the street below. I went back to sleep, but I kept the light on that night just in case. A couple of days later, I received another letter. It was just like the first one, old, yellowed, and unsigned. This time, the message was more urgent. It's already too late. He's watching you. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right anymore. I started to do some research on the building, hoping to find out more about its history. And that's when things took a darker turn. Apparently, the apartment complex had been built in the 1970s, but before that, there had been an old house on the property. From what I could gather, the house had burned down in the early 60s, and there were rumors that the owner, a man named Richard Blake, had mysteriously disappeared around that time. Some said he had just up and left, but others whispered about something darker, something that involved a tragic fire and a family that had vanished without a trace. The more I read, the more the pieces started to fit. The old house was gone, replaced by the apartment complex. But the unsettling part was that Richard Blake was never found. There were no official reports of what had happened to him, and no one knew if he had survived the fire or not. Some people even claimed to have seen his figure lurking around the area late at night, but it was all just rumors. After reading about Blake, I felt even more uneasy. Could it be possible that whatever had happened to him was tied to this apartment? I started feeling like I was being watched, like someone was lingering just beyond my sight. I couldn't explain it, but the sensation was there, heavy and suffocating. A few days later, I received a third letter. This time, it wasn't a warning, it was an invitation. You have to come to the basement. You need to see what he left behind. I knew I had to do it. Something inside me felt like I had no choice. It was as if the letters were drawing me in, leading me somewhere I didn't want to go but had to. That night, I made my way down to the basement, my heart racing in my chest. The basement was dimly lit, the air heavy with dust, and the smell of something old. As I walked through the narrow hallway, I found a door at the end that had been wedged open. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. What I found in that basement was something I'll never forget. There in the far corner was a collection of old, dusty boxes. Among the boxes, there was a pile of burned photographs, their edges blackened but still recognizable. I picked one up, my hands shaking. It was a picture of a man, Richard Blake, I realized, and standing next to him was a woman, her face blurry, but I could make out the outline of a child in her arms. That's when I felt it. A cold presence that had been lingering in the apartment for weeks. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, no one was there. I bolted out of the basement, my mind spinning. The letters had led me there for a reason, but I still don't know what the purpose was. I haven't been back to that apartment since that night. I moved out the next week, and I haven't received any more letters. but I'm still haunted by the feeling that something or someone is still watching me. The locked door to nowhere. I've been holding off on sharing this story for a while now. Honestly, I'm not sure what I experienced, but looking back, I can't deny that something weird and creepy happened. It still gives me chills to think about. So, it all started about 2 months ago when my friend Maddie moved into this old townhouse. She had just moved to the city for a new job, and her place was a bit farther from the downtown area than she had expected, but she was just happy to find a place to stay. It was one of those buildings that looked like it had been built in the 1920s and hadn't been renovated since. The front door creaked every time you opened it, and the hallways were dark even in the middle of the day. The whole vibe just gave me a weird feeling, but Maddie was pretty excited about it. It was cheap and it had its charm, so she brushed off my concerns. When I visited her for the first time, everything seemed okay, just a little outdated. She showed me around, and the place had a lot of character, but there was one room at the back of the townhouse that was always locked. I thought it was strange, but Maddie didn't seem too bothered by it. She said it was a storage room that the landlord had locked off because the door was a bit rickety and didn't quite shut right. She promised me it was no big deal, but there was something about that locked door that bugged me. It was like it was just there, this presence that I couldn't shake. After that, I started visiting her a lot more often. Maddie was always really friendly, outgoing, so we hang out, have some drinks, watch movies, and just catch up on life. But the more time I spent at her place, the more I noticed things that didn't seem right. Like the air in her apartment always felt heavy, especially near that locked door. I'm not talking about a musty or dusty smell, just this odd, cold pressure that would settle in the room. I didn't say anything to Maddie at first because I didn't want to seem like I was overreacting, but after a while, it started to feel uncomfortable, like we were being watched. One night, Maddie invited me over to watch a movie. It was just the two of us, so we were hanging out in the living room, laughing about random stuff. I don't even remember what happened exactly, but at some point, I got up to go to the bathroom. As I walked down the hallway, I couldn't help but glance at the locked door. I don't know why, but I had this overwhelming urge to just touch the door. I didn't know what I expected, but as my hand brushed against the knob, I felt something that made my stomach turn. It wasn't a normal door handle. It was cold, like something was trying to pull me in. I quickly stepped back, feeling like an idiot for letting my imagination run wild. But the feeling lingered. I couldn't shake the thought that there was something behind that door, something alive, waiting. I had no clue why I thought that, but it was like my instincts were telling me I shouldn't mess with it. Later that evening, Maddie was in the kitchen making us snacks when I saw it. Through the small crack under the door, I noticed something moving. It wasn't just a shadow from the light or a draft. It was more like a flicker, almost like someone was shuffling around behind the door. I froze. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to freak Maddie out, so I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But that night, as we were sitting on the couch, I could hear a faint sound coming from that room, a scratching noise, like something was trying to get out. At first, I thought it was just the pipes or the building settling, but it sounded too deliberate, too rhythmic. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I finally told Maddie the next day, just casually mentioning that I heard something odd the night before. She looked at me for a second, and I could see the hint of discomfort in her eyes. "Oh, that," she said, laughing it off. "It's just the old pipes. They're noisy. You get used to it." But she didn't seem all that convinced. I could tell something was off. She wasn't as carefree about the locked door as she had been when she first moved in. I didn't push her, but I could tell she knew something was wrong. It wasn't long after that when the real weirdness started. One night, Maddie texted me out of nowhere and asked if I wanted to hang out at her place. I didn't think much of it, so I stopped by around 8 p.m. When I got there, Maddie wasn't home yet. She had left a note on the door telling me to just come in and make myself comfortable. I thought it was a little odd that she hadn't mentioned anything about her plans, but I shrugged it off. So I went in. But as soon as I did, I noticed something strange. The door to the locked room was wide open. I stood there for a moment staring at it. The room was pitch black, but I could see faint movement from within. I had no idea what to do. I was paralyzed, staring into the darkness when I heard a voice from the kitchen. It was Maddie. I rushed into the kitchen, trying to act casual. "Maddie, the door to that room is open," I said, hoping I wasn't sounding too freaked out. Her face went pale, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. She dropped the glass she was holding. "What do you mean, it's open?" she whispered, voice shaky. I mean, it's wide open. I didn't touch it, but it was just like that when I came in. Maddie didn't answer. She grabbed a flashlight from a drawer and walked toward the door, her hands trembling as she turned the handle. I stayed behind, unsure of what to do. When she opened the door, the flashlight's beam caught something. It was an old trunk, the kind that looked like it had been there for decades. But the weirdest part, there were fresh scratch marks on the side of it, like something or someone had tried to claw their way out. I didn't want to say it, but I had this sick feeling in my stomach. Whatever was in that room, it wasn't just pipes or old walls. Something was wrong. Maddie didn't speak. She just closed the door and locked it again. We didn't talk much after that. I never went back to Maddie's place after that night. She called me a few days later, but I didn't answer. It's been weeks, and I still think about that locked room. Maddie eventually moved out, and I heard from someone else that she never spoke about what happened. I don't know what was in that room, but I know it was something that shouldn't have been there. I still get the feeling that it's waiting for someone else to open the door again. The old doll. I've been debating whether or not to share this story for months. It's not something I talk about often because every time I do, it feels like the memories creep up on me again. But I figured maybe sharing it here might help me get some clarity or at least a little peace of mind. It all started when my friend Ikra moved into this old, kind of rundown house. It was in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place you drive by and think, that place looks abandoned, but then realize people actually live there. The house was huge for just her, and it had been on the market for ages, but the price was super cheap, so she jumped on it. She always had a thing for old houses, the kind with creaky floors and ancient wallpaper. The first time I saw it, I remember thinking, this place looks like it's straight out of a horror movie. But Ikra just laughed and said, nah, it's perfect for me. Character. We went inside, and yeah, it had character, all right. The living room was covered in dusty, dark wood panels, the kind that made the air feel heavy and thick. The stairs creaked with every step, and the kitchen had that strange smell of old wood mixed with something sweet, like dried flowers or herbs. The house had a vibe that made you feel like someone was always watching you, even when you were alone. Ikra didn't seem to notice any of that. She was just excited to start unpacking and get settled in. I helped her with boxes, and as we made our way through the house, we came across this weird little room at the back of the house. It was barely big enough for a bed and had only one tiny window. But the strangest thing was in the center of the room, a doll. It was sitting on a wooden shelf, staring out with these lifeless glass eyes. It had a frilly pink dress on, and its hair was tangled and frizzy. I couldn't help but shiver when I saw it, but Ikra just shrugged. Oh, I think the last owners must have left it behind. It's kind of cute though, right? I wasn't so sure. There was just something off about it. The way its head was tilted slightly to the side, like it was looking at you, no matter where you were in the room. But I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I kept my mouth shut. A few days later, I was at Ikra's place, helping her organize her new kitchen. The house was quiet, and I'd noticed something that made my skin crawl. The doll wasn't on the shelf anymore. It was sitting on the floor, in the exact spot where I had last seen it, with its eyes still staring at me. I thought maybe Ikra had moved it for some reason, but she insisted she hadn't touched it. You're probably just imagining things, she said, laughing. It's just an old doll. But after that, I started noticing other things. Sometimes I'd come over to hang out, and the doll would be in a different place. First, it was on the couch, then it was on the table in the dining room, and once it was even in the bathroom. I asked Ikra if she was messing with me, but she denied it every time. Seriously, I haven't touched it, she'd say. But it didn't make sense. The doll had no reason to be moving around on its own. Ikra didn't seem to care, though. She'd laugh it off and tell me I was being ridiculous. But one night, when I stayed over at her place, things got worse. We were watching movies in the living room, and I was sitting on the couch. Ikra was making snacks in the kitchen, and everything was fine, until I heard a sound. It was a faint scratching, like something small was being dragged across the floor. I looked over, and there it was again, the doll. It was moving, slowly creeping across the floor, like it had a mind of its own. I freaked out. I immediately jumped up and grabbed the doll, shoving it back onto the shelf where it belonged. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't understand what was happening. How was this even possible? I looked around, but the room was empty, and nothing else seemed out of place. Ikra came in, and I tried to explain what had happened, but she just shook her head. Ikra, I'm serious. The doll was moving. It was dragging itself across the floor. She looked at me like I was crazy. You've been watching too many horror movies. It's just a doll, okay? You're overthinking it. But I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something wasn't right. I had a horrible feeling in my gut that the doll was alive in some way. It felt like it was trying to tell me something. The next few days were even worse. Every time I went to Ikra's house, the doll would be somewhere new. It would be in the living room, on the stairs, or even in the kitchen. It always seemed to be following me, watching me. I couldn't understand how it was happening, but I started to feel paranoid. I started to wonder if Ikra was playing some kind of sick joke on me, but no matter how many times I asked her about it, she'd just say it wasn't her. I started avoiding Ikra's place. I didn't want to deal with the doll anymore. But one night, I got a text from her. She said she was out with some friends and that I could come over if I wanted to hang out. I reluctantly agreed, and when I arrived, I was relieved to see the doll wasn't in the living room or anywhere else I could see. I sat down trying to relax, but something felt off. I went to use the bathroom, and when I came back, the doll was sitting on the couch, staring at me again. Ikra had no explanation. She said she'd left the house for hours, but when she came back, the doll was sitting there just like before. That's when I decided I had to leave. I couldn't stay there anymore. Something about the doll, the way it seemed to be alive, was driving me insane. I haven't been back to Ikra's house since then. I don't know what happened to the doll or if it's still there, but I can't shake the feeling that it's watching me even now. If anyone out there has had a similar experience with something like this, I'd love to hear it. But honestly, part of me wishes I could forget it ever happened. I don't know what happened to me, honestly. I've always been the kind of person who's super organized. Everything in its place. I like things to stay where I leave them. And then, well, this whole thing started. So I moved into this tiny apartment in the city a couple of months ago. It's not fancy, but it's got good vibes and it's affordable, which is pretty rare these days. The first few weeks were chill. I was unpacking, getting used to the neighborhood, and just enjoying the quiet. The place wasn't perfect, but it worked for me. Then one day, I put my keys on the kitchen counter as I always do. I was in a rush to get out the door, so I just dropped them there and left. When I came back, they weren't on the counter. I checked the table, the chairs, the sink. Nowhere to be found. I figured I just forgot where I put them. Maybe they fell off the counter or something, so I searched the apartment. No keys. I spent like 20 minutes looking around, getting more and more annoyed. I finally gave up and called a locksmith to come out and change the locks, as I was pretty sure I had just lost them. The locksmith came, fixed everything, and it wasn't that big of a deal. But it started the cycle of weird stuff happening that I couldn't explain. A few days later, I put my wallet down on the coffee table and went into the kitchen to grab a drink. When I came back, it was gone. I searched everywhere. I checked under the couch cushions, the kitchen counter, even the bathroom. It was just gone. I thought I might have just misremembered where I put it, but that was starting to feel like a stretch. The weird part. The next morning, my wallet was sitting on the coffee table, exactly where I had left it. I don't know if I was just losing my mind, but that was the first time I really started feeling freaked out. I thought maybe I was just overtired or stressed, so I didn't think too much of it. But then the next incident happened, and that's when I started wondering if something really strange was going on. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was cleaning the place up, doing some laundry. I just finished folding some clothes and went to hang up a jacket in the closet. As I reached for the hanger, I saw something weird, my keys. They were sitting on the shelf of the closet on top of a pile of jackets. I froze. I know I hadn't put them there. There was no way. I never leave my keys anywhere else. I don't even use the closet much. I grabbed the keys, walked into the kitchen, and checked the counter. Of course they weren't there. So I just stood there for a minute trying to make sense of it. It was like someone was messing with me, but I was alone in the apartment. I didn't want to admit it, but something about the whole situation felt wrong. It wasn't just random forgetfulness or being disorganized. It was something else. It didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, it happened more and more. Objects would just go missing. My phone charger was one of the first things. One minute, it's plugged into the wall next to my bed, and the next minute, I can't find it anywhere. I check under the bed, in the bathroom, and even the kitchen. For some reason, I started checking random places like the kitchen just to see if it would turn up. But no, nothing. It would always show up somewhere totally unexpected. A few days later, I found the charger tucked into the back pocket of my jeans. jeans I hadn't worn in days. And the weirdest part, I never put it there. I had to admit it to myself. There was something off. My stuff was disappearing, reappearing, and sometimes appearing in places I knew I hadn't put them. The whole thing made me feel like I was losing my mind. One night, I had enough. I decided to get to the bottom of it, so I set up my phone's camera and pointed it at the counter where I usually leave my wallet, keys, and phone when I come in. I didn't really expect to see anything. Maybe I was just too tired, too stressed, but I needed to prove I wasn't going crazy. The next morning, I checked the footage, and sure enough, there it was. I watched as the camera recorded the kitchen. For about 5 minutes, nothing happened. Then my wallet just slid across the counter all on its own. It didn't fall or get knocked over. It moved like someone had picked it up and pushed it across the counter. I honestly can't explain it. I watched that part over and over, trying to see if there was a string, or if maybe it was just some weird shadow or reflection. But there was nothing. The wallet just moved by itself. That's when I realized that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the only one in the apartment. And no, I'm not saying it was a ghost or some spooky supernatural thing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else, somewhere or something, was there with me messing with my stuff. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. I started locking the door every time I left the apartment and double-checking every room before I went to bed. I even called a friend to stay with me for a night because I was honestly too freaked out to be alone. But here's the kicker: a few days ago, I decided to move some of my stuff around, trying to shake off this feeling that I was being watched. As I moved a book off the shelf, something caught my eye. It was a small folded up note hidden behind the book. I opened it. It just said one thing: I'm still here. That was it. I haven't told anyone about it yet because, honestly, I don't know what's happening. But things haven't stopped disappearing. The weirdest part: I've been hearing soft footsteps at night, like someone's pacing around the living room when I'm trying to fall asleep. The worst part is, I don't know who or what it is, but it doesn't feel like I'm alone anymore. I guess, if anything, I'm just trying to get used to it. I don't know if that's a good idea, but what else can I do? The lamp I wish I never bought. I never believed in haunted stuff. I mean, sure, I love a good horror movie or ghost story. But I was always the person who rolled my eyes at people who said their house was haunted or they bought something cursed. I thought it was all just stories or people trying to sell books, until I found that lamp. It was a Saturday morning, I was bored, so I decided to hit up the local thrift store. I don't really need anything, but I like looking for cheap stuff. And sometimes you can find some pretty cool vintage things for dirt cheap. Honestly, it's the one place where I can lose track of time just browsing through random items that people clearly didn't want anymore. Anyway, this lamp caught my eye right away. It was an old-style desk lamp, kind of like the ones from the 60s. It had this brass-colored base and a green shade. Not anything that I would normally go for, but something about it felt weirdly appealing. It didn't look expensive or fancy, but it had this worn vintage charm that made me want to take it home. I debated it for a minute because the price tag was a little higher than I usually like to spend on random thrift store finds, but I figured it'd look good on my desk. So I bought it and took it home. The first few days, everything was fine. I put the lamp on my desk, plugged it in, and it gave off this soft, warm glow that was perfect for reading or working late. I liked the way it looked in my room. It made everything feel a little cozier. But then things started happening. It started with the light flickering. Not all the time, but every once in a while. At first, I thought it was just a loose bulb, so I tightened it. But it kept happening. Sometimes I'd be in my room, reading, and the lamp would flicker for a second, then go out. I would have to tap it a couple of times for it to come back on. It was strange, but nothing that made me super freaked out. I mean, it's an old lamp, right? It's bound to have some quirks. But then I started noticing something else. A weird smell. It wasn't a bad smell, just musty kind of odor. It was like old wood, maybe a bit of mildew, but faint. It wasn't strong enough to be unbearable, but I noticed it every time I turned the lamp on. At first, I thought it might be the lamp itself, like maybe it had been stored in a damp place for too long or something. But the more I used it, the more the smell seemed to linger around the room even after I turned it off. It was getting to the point where I'd wake up in the middle of the night and smell it, and the lamp would be on. Even when I was sure I'd turned it off before going to bed. It didn't take long for me to start getting freaked out. I didn't want to admit it, but something about that lamp was starting to feel off. One night, After the flickering had gotten worse, I decided to take a closer look. I unscrewed the bulb and checked the wiring to see if anything was wrong. That's when I found it. A small piece of paper rolled up and tucked behind the socket inside the lamp. I wasn't sure what it was at first, but it was kind of old, like it had been there for a long time. I opened it up. The paper was yellowed, and the handwriting was smudged and hard to read, but I could make out a few words. The name Evelyn was written at the top, followed by help me. That was it. No date, no other information, just that name and those words. It didn't make any sense to me. Who would put something like that in a lamp? I threw the paper away and tried to forget about it. But the next night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the note. I kept thinking about the smell. The flickering light. It was almost like the lamp was trying to tell me something. But that was ridiculous, right? It was just a lamp. I kept telling myself that. But things only got worse. I'd wake up with the lamp on, and sometimes I'd swear I could hear faint voices when it flickered. Low murmurs like whispers that I couldn't quite make out. I started to get paranoid. I thought maybe I was just overthinking it, so I invited my friend Jamie over to stay for a few days to help me reset my mind. We were watching movies late one night when the lamp started flickering again. Jamie noticed it too, and I could tell the look on her face that she wasn't comfortable with it either. At some point, I decided to unplug the lamp and put it in the closet, thinking maybe the whole thing would stop if I just stopped using it. But that night, as I lay in bed, I could still smell it. That musty smell like something old and forgotten, just hanging in the air. And then I heard it. A voice. A whisper, clear as day, right in my ear. Help me. I jumped up, my heart racing, and looked around my room, but there was nothing there. Kenny was still asleep, and the lamp was in the closet, unplugged. I couldn't explain what happened. I barely slept that night, and when I woke up in the morning, I decided I had had enough. I couldn't take it anymore. I went back to the thrift store, hoping they'd take the lamp back. The store owner looked at me a little oddly when I tried to return it, but she said she couldn't refund it because they didn't accept returns. I told her about the weird stuff that had been happening, and her face went pale. She told me that the lamp came from an estate sale, and that it had belonged to a woman named Evelyn who had passed away in the house. Apparently, people said she was troubled and had lived alone for years, but I didn't want to hear any more of the story. I left the store without the lamp. I don't know if it was the lamp itself or something else, but after I got rid of it, everything went back to normal. No more flickering, no more smells, no more whispers. I still don't believe in haunted things, but I'll never buy another lamp from a thrift store again. The forgotten mirror. I wasn't detected by things I didn't need, especially from yard sales. But that afternoon, I don't know what came over me. I was just driving through my neighborhood when I saw a little sale. It was one of those unorganized ones, the kind where there's random stuff scattered on tables and blankets. Most of it looked like junk, then I saw it. A mirror. It was big, probably about 5 feet tall. The frame was a heavy, dark wood, worn down with age, the corners chipped and scratched. The glass had a few visible cracks running through it, but there was something about it that caught my attention. It wasn't perfect, but it had an eerie, antique vibe that I couldn't ignore. The woman selling it was older, maybe in her 70s, with sharp eyes that seemed to look right through me. She gave me a strange smile and I showed interest in it, as if she knew something I didn't. "You sure you want that one?" she asked. "It's got some history." Her voice was raspy, and I couldn't tell if she was just trying to make it sound more appealing or if there was something to her warning. But I didn't care. I liked the mirror. It was different. It wasn't like the cheap stuff you'd find in a regular store. "Yeah, I'll take it," I said, and just at that, it was mine. I got it home that afternoon feeling kind of giddy about it. My place was small, and I didn't have a lot of furniture, so I thought it might look cool in the living room. I hung it out next to the window, and for the first few days, I didn't think much of it. It was just a mirror. But after a week or so, I started noticing strange things. The first thing was the reflection. It wasn't like a typical mirror where you just look at yourself and go about your day. This one felt different. Sometimes I would catch myself staring at it longer than I intended, like I was waiting for something to happen. At first, I thought it was just the way the light hit it. But after a few days, I realized there was something off about the way it reflected the room. It was subtle at first. I'd walk into the living room, and when I glanced at the mirror, I'd see myself in a different position that had actually moved. Like I'd walk past the couch and catch a glimpse of my reflection still standing by the door, even though I already crossed the room. Or sometimes I'd leave the room and come back to find objects that weren't there before. A chair that was turned at a weird angle, a coat draped over the back of it, even though I hadn't touched it. The weirdest part, the reflection didn't always look like me. There were times I'd look into the mirror, and it would show me standing in the exact spot, but I would look different. It wasn't just my clothes or my hair. There was something about the way I looked. My face seemed off, like my expression didn't match the way I was feeling. And sometimes when I blinked, it was like the reflection blinked too at the wrong time. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just imagining things. That mirror's mess with the light, and maybe the cracks in the glass made it look weird, but a strange feeling lingered. It all came to a head one night when I woke up in the middle of the night. I had a nightmare, nothing special, but something about it felt real. I felt awake but disoriented, and when I looked at the clock, it was 3:14 and I lay there in the dark, listening to the soft hum of the house when I heard it. A faint sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone was walking through the living room. I sat up in bed, trying to convince myself it was the house selling, maybe the wind knocking something over. But then I heard it again. A step. Then another. Closer. My heart started to race and I felt a chill wash over me. I knew there was no one else in the house. I got out of bed, trying to move quietly, and crept down the hallway toward the living room. I was about to turn the corner when I noticed something strange. The mirror. It was reflecting a portion of the living room I couldn't see from where I was standing. There was a figure in the reflection, but when I looked directly into the room, there was nothing there. I took a step forward, my breath shallow, and peered into the mirror. The figure in the reflection was standing in the exact spot I was just about to pass, frozen in place. It was me, but not quite. The figure was dressed in the same clothes, but there was something dark about it. The reflection looked like I was just standing there staring at myself. I turned around to look behind me. Nothing. I took a step back. The figure in the mirror didn't move. I couldn't explain it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my instincts screamed at me to leave the room. But I couldn't move. I kept staring at the mirror, expecting the figure to move, but it stayed still. Then something else happened. I blinked, and for just a fraction of a second, the reflection changed. It wasn't me anymore. The figure in the mirror was standing in a different position, closer to me, and its eyes were wide open, unblinking. But I hadn't moved. It was as if it was waiting for me. That's when I ran. I bolted back to my room and slammed the door behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. I lay in bed for hours, not daring to look back at the mirror. I knew it was still there, hanging in the living room, silently watching me. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. I didn't want to go anywhere near the living room, but I knew I had to. I had to get rid of the mirror. When I walked into the living room, the mirror was the same as always, but there was something different about the reflection. It wasn't me this time. It was a figure standing in the same spot. And as I stared into the glass, I noticed something chilling. The figure in the reflection was smiling. The midnight knock. I never thought I'd be writing a story like this, but here I am, and I still don't really know how to explain it. So I moved into this old apartment about 6 months ago. It's one of those places that's got charm, but also a weird vibe. Like, it's not exactly run down, but it's a little off. The floorboards creak no matter where you step. The elevator makes weird noises when it moves, and the lights in the hallway flicker sometimes. But it's cheap and in a good location, so I didn't really care. At first, everything seemed normal. I was settling in, figuring out how to make the place feel like home. The first few weeks went by fine. I was still getting used to the sounds of the building, so I just figured I was imagining things when I hear footsteps in the hallway at night. It wasn't unusual in a building like this. Maybe someone was just coming home late or going to work early. But then one night, something happened that made me question everything. I was sitting on the couch around midnight, scrolling through my phone. My roommate Adam had gone out with some friends, so I was alone in the apartment. It was pretty quiet, except for the usual sounds of the building. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the door. Not like a gentle knock or a tap, but a bang, bang, bang. It was loud enough to make me jump. I froze for a second. Who the hell could be knocking at this hour? I'm a fairly private person, and I didn't really expect anyone to come over that late. I got up, walked over to the peephole, and looked through. No one. I waited for a second, thinking maybe I just missed them, but nope. No one was out there. I was confused, but I didn't think too much of it at first. Maybe it was just someone at the wrong door, or maybe I imagined it. I went back to the couch and tried to ignore it, but then like clockwork, there it was again. Another set of loud knocks. Bang, bang, bang. I jumped up again and looked through the peephole. Still nothing. Now I was starting to get weirded out. I stood there for a while, thinking it over. My first instinct was to call Adam, but I didn't want to freak him out. I wasn't sure if I was just being paranoid, so I decided to wait and see if it happened again. About 10 minutes later, it did. Knock, knock, knock. Same pattern, like someone was trying to get my attention. I was getting pretty freaked out at this point, so I called the building's maintenance guy, Dave. He was usually pretty chill. I figured he could at least tell me if there was something going on in the building. Dave picked up on the first ring. I told him what was happening, and he asked me if I was sure it was the door. I said, yeah, it sounds like someone was knocking. He was quiet for a second, then said, I'll come by and check. I hung up, feeling a little better, but also more uneasy. I didn't know why, but something about it felt wrong. I just wanted to get to the bottom of it. Dave arrived about 20 minutes later. When he knocked on the door, I opened it, and he immediately looked at the hallway. He didn't say anything for a second, and he told me to keep the door closed and wait inside. I didn't understand why, but I did as he said. He walked down the hallway looking both ways, then came back and knocked on the door again, signaling me to open it. I didn't hear anything he said, but he looked a little pale. Just, be careful, all right? Don't open the door to anyone unless you know who it is. I was already feeling uneasy, but that didn't help. I thanked him and he left, but the whole interaction stuck with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound made me jump. I kept hearing footsteps in the hall and the knock. It didn't stop. Every hour on the dot, another knock would sound on the door. Sometimes it would be a few seconds before the knock started. Other times they'd come right after I had gotten comfortable. After a few days, I started to lose it. I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating right. I couldn't focus. Adam noticed, and I told him about the knocks. He didn't really believe me at first, but after a couple of nights of hearing it himself, he started to get worried too. Then one night, while I was sitting on the couch, I heard something different. The knocks came again, but this time it was followed by something else. A soft voice, almost a whisper, calling my name. It was barely audible, but I swear I heard it. My name, over and over. At that point, I couldn't take any more. I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend for a few nights. When I came back, the knocks had stopped, but the air of the apartment still felt heavy, like it was holding on to something. To this day, I don't know who or what was knocking at my door. I never saw anyone in the hallway, and no one ever admitted to it. But I know what I heard, and I know that something in that building didn't want me there. I still live in the same apartment, but I don't go out at night anymore, and I double-check the locks before bed. I've told a few friends about it, but they think I'm just making it up. Honestly, I don't blame them. If I hadn't lived it, I wouldn't believe it either. The Forgotten Neighbor. I moved into my first solo apartment about a year ago. It was a small place, but it felt like a big step for me. I was so excited to finally be living alone, no roommates, just me and my space. The apartment was in a decent neighborhood, quiet, mostly older people living around, which I thought would be perfect. I could get my work done, maybe a few neighbors, but nothing too intrusive. Everything was going well at first. I was getting used to the creaky floors, the sounds of traffic outside, and the building's weird old elevator. But there was one thing I noticed right away, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. There was this old lady who lived next door. I never saw her, but every time I go out to grab my mail or take out the trash, I'd notice that her apartment door was always cracked open just a little. It seemed odd because I had never seen her, not once, and the door being left open like that made me feel like she was either in or out, but never fully in between. It was a little eerie. I mean, who leaves their door open all the time? At first, I thought maybe she was just some eccentric older person who didn't mind the door being ajar. But after a while, it started to get to me. I'd hear strange noises at night, like faint knocking or scraping sounds from the wall between our apartments. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the building settling or pipes, whatever. But after a few weeks, it was hard to shake off the feeling that something was off. One night, I decided to knock on her door to introduce myself. I figured maybe she's just super quiet or shy, and I'd go over, say hi, and make sure everything was okay. So I did. I knocked on the door and waited. No answer. I knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. I was about to give up when I noticed the door wasn't completely shut. It was cracked open like it always was. So I did something I now regret. I pushed the door open a bit more and called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" There was no answer at first, though I swear, I felt this weird cold draft hit me. I stepped inside, which in hindsight was probably not the best idea. The apartment was pitch dark, and the air inside was stale. I called out again, a little louder this time, but still nothing. I walked further into the apartment, and that's when I noticed how strange everything looked. The place was completely untouched, like no one had lived there in years. There were old newspapers stacked in the corner, and the furniture was covered in dust. It didn't feel lived in at all. But the weirdest part, there was food in the kitchen, sitting on the counter. Half-eaten sandwiches, a cup of coffee. It was like she had just left in a hurry and never came back. At that point, I was really starting to feel weird about the whole thing. I backed up toward the door, and as I did, I noticed something else that I hadn't seen before. On the wall near the entrance, there was a picture frame, and inside it was a photo of the old lady, except she wasn't smiling. She looked sad, maybe even distressed. And the odd thing was, she was standing in the exact same spot where I had just walked in. That was enough for me. I turned and ran out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. I don't know why, but I didn't want to go back in. It felt like I had disturbed something, like I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I couldn't stop thinking about her apartment, about the photo, and about the food sitting there being eaten. I told a few people about it later, and most of them brushed it off as me being dramatic. But the weirdest part happened the next day. I was walking out of my apartment when I saw a maintenance worker in the hallway. He was fiddling with a broken light in the ceiling. I thought it would be the perfect time to ask him about the old lady next door, so I casually asked, "Hey, do you know anything about the neighbor in 2B? I've never seen her around." The guy just looked at me, then looked down the hallway at 2B, and his face went pale. He paused for a second, then said, "There's no one in 2B been empty for years. The lady who lived there, well, she passed away a long time ago. No one's lived there since." I was absolutely speechless. I told him that I'd seen the door open and there was food in the kitchen. He just shook his head like I was crazy and walked off without saying anything else. I went back to my apartment in a daze, feeling like I had just stepped into some kind of weird, creepy movie. I couldn't make sense of it. Had I imagined it all, or was something seriously wrong with the building? That was about 2 months ago, and since then I've been avoiding the hallway as much as possible. I never see anyone around the building anymore, but occasionally I'll hear that weird scraping noise, like furniture being moved or something dragging along the floor from the direction of apartment 2B. Sometimes I'll smell the faint scent of food cooking, like someone's in there making dinner. But every time I go to check, there's nothing there. I don't know if I'm losing it or if something weird is going on in that building. But I do know one thing for sure. I haven't heard any knocks on my door since that night. I just hope I never do again. The reoccurring dream. I don't really know where to start with this, but I gotta get it off my chest. Maybe writing it down will help me make sense of everything that's happened, but I doubt it. It all started a few months ago. At first, it was just one of those weird dreams you forget about the moment you wake up. But for some reason, this one stuck with me. I couldn't shake it. The dream was always the same. A dark, old house that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The kind of place you'd expect to see in those creepy horror movies. Boarded up windows, a rusty gate, and this feeling of emptiness that I couldn't escape, even though I knew it was just a dream. Every night I dream about it. The first time, I was just walking around the outside, looking out the house from the overgrown front yard. The second time I actually went inside. I remember how cold it felt. The air was thick and the floor was creaked beneath me. Everything about it felt off, like I was trespassing in a place that wasn't meant for anyone. The furniture was covered in dust and sheets, the walls cracked and peeling, but there was one room I kept coming back to. It was this old, dimly lit bedroom at the end of the hall. There was a rocking chair in the corner, and the floor was scattered with what looked like old photographs. They were all too blurry to make out, but there was this sense of familiarity with them, like I should recognize them, but I couldn't. The last time I dreamt about the house, I even went to the window, pulled back the old, tattered curtains, and looked out. but it was just a vast empty field. No neighbors, no cars, nothing. It didn't make sense. But after the fourth or fifth night, I stopped thinking of it as just a dream. It felt real, like I was actually there, like the place existed somewhere and somehow I knew it. A few weeks later, I was driving home from work when I saw it. It was the house, the same one from my dreams. I had to slam on the brakes because I almost crashed right into it. I blinked and stared at the place, my heart racing. It was real. It looked exactly like the house from my dreams, down to the rotting front gate and the peeling paint. Same eerie feel to it, like something was watching me from behind those broken windows. I didn't stop, but my curiosity was eating at me. I had to know more, so I circled the block, just looking, trying to get my bearings. The house was on a quiet street, almost hidden away from the rest of the neighborhood. It didn't look like anyone had lived there for years. No lights, no sign of life. And then I saw the for sale sign. That's when the fear hit me. Who would put a house like that on the market? I don't know much about real estate, but it seemed strange. No one had lived there for a long time, and the place looked like it was about to fall apart. But there it was as a for sale sign, just hanging there like it was no big deal. I sat there in my car, just staring at it, trying to figure out if I was going crazy. I couldn't stop thinking about the house. I've been having those dreams for weeks now, and now I had found it in real life. I was starting to feel like there was a reason behind it, like there was some connection I needed to figure out. The next day, I decided to go to the real estate agent's office. I was hoping they could tell me more about the house, give me some context. But when I walked in, I was met with a strange look from the receptionist. It was like she knew exactly why I was there, but she didn't want to talk about it. I asked about the house. The one on Elm Street 453, I said, trying to sound casual. She froze for a second, then quickly scribbled something down on a notepad and told me to talk to someone named Linda. She said Linda was in charge of that property. When Linda came out to greet me, she gave me a tight smile like she was trying to hide something. "How can I help you?" she asked, but there was something about her tone that made me uneasy. I told her I was interested in the house and asked if I could see it. Linda looked me up and down, almost like she was sizing me up, then nodded. "Sure," she said. "It's available, but I'll warn you it's not for everyone." Her words stuck with me as she led me to the house. The walk there felt like I was being pulled into something I didn't fully understand. As we walked, she didn't say much, just that the house had been abandoned for a long time and that it needed serious repairs. Nothing I hadn't already guessed. When we arrived, I was shocked. Standing in front of the house felt different than just seeing it from a car. Up close, it was even more terrifying, like it was waiting for me. I could hear the wind rattling the broken windows, and the smell of mildew hit me the second I stepped onto the porch. Linda handed me the keys and said, "Take a look around. But don't stay too long. People don't stay long in this house." I felt like she was warning me, but I didn't know why. I walked inside, the door creaking loudly as I pushed it open. The inside was even worse than I'd imagined. Everything was covered in dust, and there was this overwhelming sense of dread in the air. It was like the house itself didn't want anyone there. I wandered through the rooms, each one colder than the last, until I reached the bedroom at the end of the hall. The rocking chair was still there, and the old photographs were still scattered across the floor. But this time they were clearer. As I knelt down to pick one up, I felt a cold hand brush my shoulder. My heart skipped a beat, and I whipped around, but there was no one there, just silence. I could feel it now, the presence. It was like the house was alive, and it didn't want me here. The longer I stayed, the more I felt that pull, like the house was trying to keep me trapped. Before I knew it, I ran out of there, slamming the door behind me. When I turned around, I saw Linda standing in the doorway, watching me, her eyes wide. "You shouldn't have gone in," she said softly, before walking back inside and closing the door behind her. I didn't go back. I couldn't. But every night, I still dream about the house. And every time I wake up, I feel like I'm being pulled back there. Something is calling me to that house, and I don't know how to stop it. The abandoned car. I don't know why I decided to stop that night. It was one of those typical uneventful late night drives. The kind where you're just cruising down some back road, tired and almost home, when something catches your attention. You can't explain why it stands out, but it does. I've been driving this stretch of road for years now, and nothing ever really happens. It's just one of those quiet rural roads, the kind where there's never much traffic, especially after dark. It was the middle of the week, a Wednesday or Thursday, I think. I was on my way home from a late shift, the kind of shift that makes you feel like a zombie. Anyway, I had seen the car parked by the side of the road for the past couple of days, but I never thought much of it. Old cars like that show up all the time around here, whether broken down or abandoned for whatever reason. The thing was, this car wasn't like any other abandoned car I'd seen. It wasn't some rusted out junker on the side of the road. It was odd. It looked like it had been there for weeks, maybe more. The tires weren't flat, and there was no for sale sign, no broken windows, no broken glass anywhere around it. It wasn't the kind of car you'd expect to be left out in the middle of nowhere. I thought maybe someone was working on it or it was part of some weird scam, but it still didn't make sense. Why hadn't it been towed? Why wasn't anyone checking on it? At first, I just drove by. Didn't think much of it, but as the days went on, I started noticing it more and more. Every time I drove that road, there it was. It was always in the same spot with no one around. No sign of anyone coming or going. No movement. Just that old, beat-up car parked there like it was waiting for something. Or someone. I had the feeling that I should have just ignored it. I knew it wasn't any of my business, but curiosity got the best of me. A few nights later, I decided to stop. I wasn't in any particular rush to get home, so I pulled over to the side of the road. The car was just sitting there, the headlights slightly cracked, the paint peeling in places. It looked so out of place, like it didn't belong there at all. I stepped out of my car, my shoes crunching the gravel beneath me. The air was cool and the road was silent except for the distant sound of rustling leaves. The weirdest thing was the stillness. The car, the area around it, everything felt unnaturally quiet, like it was holding its breath. I walked up to the car slowly, trying not to touch anything, as if some invisible force was warning me not to. The windows were rolled up, but they were dirty. I could barely see through them, but it didn't look like there was anyone inside. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was like the air itself had gotten thicker, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. But I was already this far, so I figured I'd check it out. What harm could it do? I reached for the handle, and to my surprise, it opened. The door creaked a little, and I froze for a second, almost expecting someone to jump out at me. But there was nothing. I peered inside, and the car looked perfectly normal, empty, but clean. The seats were worn, but there was no garbage, no signs of anyone having lived in it, which I thought was strange. I'd seen plenty of abandoned cars in my life, and they were usually filled with trash, old wrappers, or junk. This one, though, was spotless. It almost looked like it was being taken care of, like someone was looking after it even though no one was around. I got this weird feeling in my stomach, but I couldn't quite place it. The car didn't feel dangerous, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. I don't know why I did it, but I decided to pot the trunk. I don't know if I expected to find something valuable or something awful, but what I found was strange. The trunk was empty at first glance, but as I looked closer, I saw something pile up in the corner. It was a heap of clothes, old, rotting clothes. At first, I thought they were just old jackets or some random crap left behind, but the smell hit me before I could take a closer look, and I immediately recoiled. It wasn't just the smell of old clothes. It was worse, like mold, mildew, and something else I couldn't quite place. Something decaying. I didn't even want to touch it, but I couldn't look away. The clothes, they were bizarre. They were these faded, wrinkled shirts and pants that didn't seem to fit with the rest of the car. They didn't look old enough to have been there for years, but they were definitely not new. They looked fresh, but rotting at the same time. The fabric was damp, and there was an unsettling sense that they had been there much longer than I had thought. I swear, when I first looked at the trunk a couple of days ago, those clothes weren't there. I quickly shut the trunk and took a step back, my heart racing. What the hell was going on? I glanced around, half expecting someone to be watching me, but the road was still empty. Not a single car, not a single person. Just me, that damn car. My mind started racing with thoughts. What if someone had been watching me the whole time? What if the car wasn't abandoned at all, and someone was lurking nearby, waiting for me to get too close? I didn't want to stick around to find out. Without a second thought, I jumped into my car and sped off, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that old car still parked there, but it was just dark road behind me. For the next few days, I didn't drive that road again. The thought of that trunk, Those clothes kept me up at night. I told myself it was just some weird coincidence, or maybe I imagined it. But every time I passed that stretch of road, I'd look for the car, and it was always gone. Never there. And then one night, I drove by again, and it was back, sitting there just like before. The letter in the box. It was a typical Saturday when I finally decided to go through my late aunt's belongings. She passed away a few months ago, and I had been putting off cleaning out her house. It wasn't that I didn't want to do it, it was a lot of stuff. A lifetime's worth of memories, really. And every box, every drawer, every dusty corner I opened up felt like it came with its own layer of sadness. But I couldn't avoid it forever. It was time. I started in the attic where the boxes were stacked high. Old photo albums, knickknacks, and miscellaneous family heirlooms I'd barely recognized. But then I came across a wooden box. It was small, like one of those old jewelry boxes, but it was locked. No key in sight, of course, because who would keep a key to a locked box in their attic? But something about it called to me, so I did what any sane person would do. I picked the lock with a hairpin. Inside, I found a mix of old papers and trinkets. Nothing too exciting at first glance. A couple of tarnished rings, a few photographs of people I didn't recognize. But then, at the bottom of the box, there it was. A yellowed envelope, sealed with wax, and with a name I didn't recognize in the front. The handwriting was neat, but aged. It was addressed to someone named David Hollis, and it was postmarked from a small town about 50 miles from where I live. The letter inside was what really caught my attention. It read, October 14, 1968. Dear David, I don't know how much longer I can write. The things that have been happening here, I don't think I can ignore them any longer. Every night, the footsteps are getting closer. At first, it was just a sound in the halls, faint and distant, but now it's like they're right outside my door. I can hear them pacing back and forth, never stopping, never resting. I've tried to tell myself it's just my imagination, but I know better. I've started to receive strange messages as well, and I don't know who's sending them or how they even know about my past. They're cryptic, but they mention things no one could know. I'm starting to wonder if there's something watching me. Someone or something that's been following me for weeks now. I don't know how much time I have left, but I'm afraid. More afraid than I've ever been. Please, David, if you're reading this, don't come to this house. I fear it may already be too late for me. Please don't come. Emma. This was the letter I found. It was a strange letter, no doubt. What made it more unsettling was how it ended so abruptly, like something or someone had interrupted her. There was no signature after Emma. No further explanation. Just silence. The letter was dated over 50 years ago, so why was it in my aunt's box? Why had it been hidden away in her attic in a box she kept all this time? Something didn't sit right with me, and I couldn't get the words out of my head. I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, after sitting with the letter for a few hours, I decided to visit the address listed at the bottom. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was an urge to uncover whatever mystery lay hidden behind that letter. Either way, I had to see for myself. The next morning, I drove to the town. It wasn't far, but the closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to feel. The houses were sparse out there, the kind of place where you drive for miles, and you only see the occasional farm or empty lot. The further I went, the more isolated it became. When I turned down the street the address had led me to, my stomach dropped. The house was exactly how Emma had described it, except for one thing. It was abandoned. The windows were boarded up, the paint peeling off the walls, and the lawn was overgrown with weeds. It had clearly been left to rot for decades. No one had lived there for a very long time. But what stopped me in my tracks was the feeling that washed over me. It wasn't just the house that was unsettling. It was the silence. There was no wind, no birds, not even the hum of distant traffic. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as though the house had sucked all life out of the area around it. I stepped out of the car, my feet heavy on the gravel. My mind was racing. I wanted to turn around, I wanted to leave, but something kept pulling me forward. I crossed the yard and went out to the front door. It was hanging slightly ajar, the wood warped and twisted. I didn't want to go in, I really didn't, but curiosity got the best of me. I pushed the door open, the sound of the hinges creaking in a way that made my blood run cold. Inside, everything was covered in dust. Old furniture was scattered throughout the rooms, all of it abandoned, just like the house. The air was thick with a musty smell of decay. As I walked through the rooms, I could almost feel Emma's presence. I felt like she was still there, like she was just waiting for me to find her. The last room I checked was the one at the very back of the house. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I entered. But when I looked toward the window, something caught my eye. A shadow. It was faint at first, just a flicker, but I swear it was there, standing at the window behind the thick curtains, as if someone was watching me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't dare move, not even an inch. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the spot, but nothing else happened. It was as if whoever, or whatever, was there had disappeared. My legs moved before I could think about it. I ran out of that house faster than I've ever run in my life. I didn't even stop to look back. When I got back to my car, I couldn't stop shaking. I didn't know if what I'd seen was real or if I was just imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still there. I drove home, trying to push the images from my mind, but no matter what, I couldn't get the thought of that shadow out of my head. And the worst part, I kept hearing footsteps outside my door that night, just like Emma had described. Maybe I should listen to her. Maybe it really was too late for me.